Hi, my name is Nicola Jennings. I'm Director of Colnaghi Foundation. Welcome to Colnaghi Foundation Lates, talks with interesting people about new art exhibitions, publications and events in the UK and around the world. Hi, my name is Nicola Jennings. I'm Director of Colnaghi Foundation and I'm delighted to welcome tonight Paul Benney. Paul Benney is a contemporary artist whose work I admire greatly, and I asked Paul to come and be part of one of these podcast conversations to talk to him about his interest in various kinds of art, and in particular his interest in pre-20th century art. For the past 30 years, Paul has worked in the United States and the United Kingdom. His paintings are represented in many public collections, including the Metropolitan Museum in New York, the National Gallery of Australia, and the National Portrait Gallery in London, alongside in many prominent private and corporate collections. At some point today, Paul will also talk about an exhibition that's currently on in Stockholm, which has got his work on, which is what prompted us to think of doing this podcast now. But let's start with some of your contemporary works, Paul. I'm very interested in this one here, which is called Dying Slave, which of course immediately made me think of Michelangelo's Dying Slave, which is in the Louvre that he produced for the tomb of Julius II. Tell us a bit about this painting and about your thoughts when you were painting it and your ideas.
Yes, I can tell you a little bit about it. It's a big painting. I think it's sort of 3 meters by 2 meters, something like that. And I was interested in, and I've always been interested in the levitating body. And I started with that as an idea. And at the time I was using a model, a dancer friend of mine, who was very kind in allowing me to sort of string him up, as it were, in the studio, so that he was in this rather uncomfortable position, being held aloft. So it felt as though his body was hanging, as it were, in midair. But of course, with this painting, you can think of it as being levitating in an upward direction, or being sucked down into the depths of the whirlpool beneath him. And then as I kind of progressed with this painting, it suggested, as it often does with my work, things suggest themselves as I'm going along. And with my interest in light and flames in my work, it crops up all the time, and it does actually work in this case quite well, I think, as a sort of juxtaposition between the water and the place from where they are emanating in these whirlpools. So the Dying Slave title, yes, does come from the Michelangelo sculpture. And I just, with titles, it's always a bit difficult to kind of get it absolutely right, but there was something about the words "dying slave" that appealed to me at the time, whether that's to do with my own sort of sense of self-pity or whether it's to do with my admiration for Michelangelo.
Right, and you mentioned your interest in light. I think this is a theme which, as we'll see as we move through the paintings, recurs a lot. Where does that come from in particular?
Well, it's really odd. I've been painting light in various manifestations for, decades. And for the first sort of 20 odd years of doing those paintings, I hadn't really thought about where the concept emanated from within my thinking. So it was only in the last 10 years that, having been alerted by people who had seen the paintings and had, the Bishop of London, Richard Sharpless was one of them, was talking about the tongues of flame on the Pentecostal saints as the Holy Spirit descends on them as a tongue of flame. And I was thinking, gosh, that's really interesting. That is exactly kind of what I've been doing over the years, with these flames projecting out from the top of people's heads, or indeed from other things as well, like trees and landscapes. And so once I'd seen that as a Pentecostal image, of course I then noticed it occurring all over the place in so many other religions, and the religious iconography. You get the sacred light, or the fire or flame as representing light, which in turn represents transcendence and illumination, revelation. And so it dawned on me that this is maybe what I was after, really, in my own personal iconography.
Well, that's really interesting, because one of the artists that I believe you've been talked about in conjunction with is William Blake. And of course, there's this wonderful Angel of the Revelation, which is, I think, one of his best known works, which does have this extraordinary light in the background, doesn't it? Almost like flames coming out of his head.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very familiar religious image. You know, that kind of burst, that sunlight, that burst, that moment in Genesis. You know, let there be light, and but not only in the Bible, but in many other religious texts as well, where it's seen as the primal force without which we would not exist, and certainly our understanding of anything before us would not exist. And so, I mean, as a sort of primal force, it becomes more and more relevant to me as I understand it better. But curiously, William Blake isn't somebody I've spent a lot of time looking at. But, you know, it's that juxtaposition between the secular and divine, that cusp, which he mines very well, I think.
Yes, absolutely. Well, the quote that I was thinking of was from a recent exhibition of your work. The author said that you are beyond clear and definitive categorization, although your work can be seen to continue the strong tradition of British mysticism by the likes of Samuel Palmer and William Blake. And he goes on to say, this is because he shows us our lives as they balance on that fragile boundary between the perfectly ordinary and the profoundly otherworldly. So very much as you're saying, this concept of the cusp between the sacred and the profane.
Yes, exactly. That puts it very well, actually. I think that was Joseph Clark, if I remember rightly, who talks about it in that way. And I think that the English mystics, as it were, the artists, the mystic artists, were often a kind of strange kind of subcategory, or seen as a strange subcategory at the time. Samuel Palmer being another one. I feel more of an affinity with Samuel Palmer, actually, in a funny way. I think it's Blake's classicism that slightly unnerves me. You know, you're looking at this fellow in front of us here, it slightly reminds me of, you know, those sort of awful political... During the Second World War, there were all these kind of heroic figures striding out at you.
Yes, that sort of Soviet realism and all that kind of thing.
Yeah, and that kind of emphasis on the kind of male classical beauty, you know, that slightly puts me off in a way. Yes,
and so coming onto this painting, which I know you're wary of your titles, but you do call it Vanitas, and I can see very well why. You know, these Vanitas being the Latin for emptiness or vanity, and these were, from an art historical point of view, these are always very interesting because they were especially popular in Holland. And then they spread to other European countries in the 16th and 17th centuries, and they were typically represented, these assemblages of human objects representing the sort of the vanities of life, you know. So it could be objects of death like skulls, but also things like beautiful objects of goldwork and clocks and all these symbolic items, and even things like butterflies, you know, that had very short lives. So you're interested in all this kind of imagery too?
Yes, I am. I think with this particular painting, it has more of a connection with the Flemish painters like Lucien Ropp. I don't know if you know about him, and Max Klinger, and I have a lot of interest in both of them, and they have a kind of rather warped sense of the vanitas or the memento mori, which I like very much, and they have liberal, well, especially Ropp, have a liberal use of skulls and skeletons, and this amused me, this idea, which was a little monkey holding up a tiny little human skull, looking at it as it were in the mirror. So the vanitas is sort of implied by that.
Slightly spooky image for the times we live in now.
It doesn't. It's funny how that seems to have happened a lot lately with artists who I've noticed. They've discovered works that are very prescient in some way. I don't know if you've noticed that lately.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, one of the questions I wanted to ask you, I mean, it's a big question and we don't have to tackle it right now. We could, we could talk about it later, because obviously there are lots of other paintings I want to ask you about. But why is art important now? What from your point of view, what does it bring to us at this particular moment?
Well, this particular moment, it's a very difficult time because the audience, as it were, has sort of changed overnight. At least the means to view art has changed overnight in a profound way. And I think, though, that maybe a better question would be, what would be the outcome of all of this in terms of how we view art and its importance? I mean, there's no question that it will remain as an important endeavor, but I think the business end of art is going to change a great deal, and perhaps there'll be, because of the contingencies, as it were, that are going to have to take place to back up, the business end of it. I think there's going to be less emphasis on the price of paintings and the price of art going forward from here, because I think that part of it will become very untenable, and as what it already is. I mean, when you look at the sale records for auction houses and galleries, I mean, it's just fallen through the floor, and I don't think it's going to be. Well, I don't think the top end of the art market is going to be operating in the same way as it has done, almost as a sort of extension of the banking industry, it seems to me, and perhaps from that there might come a more or a deeper, a more kind of human understanding of what it is to make art at this particular moment.
Yeah, it's interesting because there is so much content that's being posted about art online now, through Instagram, through, people's various social media feeds, and museums are falling over themselves posting virtual exhibitions and tours. And in some ways it's a great moment, isn't it, for art, because we're all constantly looking for things to find meaning and to not even distract us, but to give us some sense of what the world's like beyond our four walls that we're caught inside, and to make us think about other things and connect.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's really true. I think this every artist I know is somehow posting stuff online as a way to find a way, sort of a sure way of communicating with the outside world, and that might actually end up being a way to find what's going on in the art world, other than what the latest record breaking price at Sotheby's is. If all of the artists are encouraged to come out online more than they have been, then we're going to be able to see what's been going on under the bed sheets, as it were.
Yes, I was amused to hear Damien Hirst on the radio. He doesn't make many forays into the public arena these days, but he was talking about why he was painting rainbows yesterday on the radio. So I think that's probably right. Coming back to your paintings, I mean, this one, I just coming back to Blake. I mean, it's interesting that you say that you feel less affinity with him than with Palmer, but again, I saw quite a strong relationship compositionally. Maybe these are things that you've sort of picked up unconsciously between these two compositions in a way, but maybe that's just coincidental. But coming on to Goya, I know that you said, I mean, this is actually now thought to be by a follower of Goya, but I know
yes.
you I think that's quite recent. I think they've sort of analysed the painting technique, and for various reasons they think it's I think that was quite close to him, but possibly not him himself. But it does come from some engravings and various. There's an unnumbered print of the Giant or Colossus from that's one of his from 1818, and there were also a series of parallel themes in his Disasters of War. So clearly this is a theme that was of interest to him. So where does it where did it spark with you?
Yeah, well, it's not it's not really this painting in particular. When you showed me this painting, I was it's one of my favourite paintings of Goya's, but it's not necessarily one that's translated into my work particularly. But Goya's work in general, particularly the levitating figures that I have had, I've done my own versions of those over the years, and there's one of his, exactly. But he did many drawings. So there's some more. Exactly.
Yes, yeah. The Witches, from the Witches and Old Women album.
Yeah. And I just find the idea of levitation, it has a strong resonance with me, and it also, I don't know, we I think we all have this sense that we would love to sort of transcend our earthly bonds at some point, and that sort of image of humans levitating, I think, feeds into that notion that we all feel at some point.
I suppose perhaps it was me that thought of asking you about the Goya, because it did. I saw resonances of that sort of that mysterious apparition of something, as not just levitating, but something that's kind of there and not there. That you get in the Colossus.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, I mean, it's a surreal image. It's like this figure in a landscape that's completely out of proportion, and not within the same paradigm as the rest of the picture. And in that sense, that relates to that painting you've just shown of mine called Tether, and it's a sort of surreal image, but it has sort of metaphorical message
and
as well.
It's interesting that you were mentioning Rops, because of course another of these sort of symbolist painters from the late 19th century is Readon, and I think you said that you liked his work as well.
Yes, Readon I absolutely love. I mean, he's another one of my northern stars. I mean, what I love about Readon is his sort of personal iconography that somehow allows you in as the viewer. I mean, you don't necessarily, maybe not everyone likes Readon, but I mean, those who do, I think, will look at his work and they know very well that this is somebody's very personal image bank, all sorts of things that are very typically Readon, and yet they somehow speak to all of us in a funny way. He's keyed into this sort of symbolism that we relate to, at least at the moment. I find that very interesting. I mean, I've always felt that my personal iconography is very much my personal iconography. It's not really a reflection even of the people, the artists I like in art history. The themes might be, but the actual iconography is very different. And I always wonder whether that is seen by people who look at my paintings as something that relates to them, in a personal way. I guess you can never really know until a long way in the future.
Here's another work of yours, which is very, very strange, and again made me think of Readon too in a funny way. But what about so these Dissemblers? Tell me something about them.
Yeah, well, there are a series of 6 paintings of this young. He's a young dancer actually, but he had a really extraordinary sort of fluidity in his movements, and so I was doing some paintings of him, and then suddenly the idea of turning him into a kind of symbol for our times occurred to me. So, the Dissembler is kind of where we're at now, where we're not sure whether we are listening to the truth or to lies. Alternative facts has become part of the new normal. So the Dissembler series seems to speak to
again.
that at the moment.
I found this head of A Damned Soul by Blake,
Yeah.
which reminded me again. I think it's weird, these
does,
kind of parallels with Blake, but of course the Readon again, which I really love this one.
He's interesting because his black and white work
Yeah.
is as powerful as the colour, and I sort of felt in a similar way when I started out years ago in New York. The first decade of my life there was spent in painting monochrome black and white paintings, very dark, very surreal in a way that Readon is, and then as I discovered Redon's interesting colour, it allowed me to, as it were, develop out of monochrome into colour, and so it was because of his development from the black and white drawings and etchings into colour that I thought, oh well, at this time that I did the same thing.
That's amazing, and I love the colours in these ones. They're fabulous.
Well, they are in a way. They're little studies on colour anyway, as well as the actual theme. Light and reflections and backlighting and
then coming back to Tether, the one that you were again, where there's a very subtle use of colour. It's almost like watercolour. It's extraordinary.
Well, again, that's quite a big painting, and it's almost monochrome. And one of the other people I would consider a North Star for me would be Andrei Tarkovsky, the Russian filmmaker. If you know his work, you will recognize, especially with this painting, a connection. He was very keen on levitation. It is part of his iconography, and also this color palette relates in a way to Tarkovsky's color palette. He color graded his films when they were in color, very pale and have a very greenish light, and to me that has a strong metaphorical kind of resonance. That kind of color grading.
Yes, it does feel very cinematic. That's true.
Yeah, maybe it does. Yeah. Is that what it feels like to you?
Yeah, absolutely. And you can feel it sort of moving upwards. You can sort of, maybe it's because of that sort of vaporous cloud that sort of it's levitating up on that, isn't it? It's amazing.
Yeah. It was interesting actually. I painted this painting. It's a big painting, but I painted it in one day, and it happened to be the day that a good friend of mine's boyfriend died, and I got told the news the next day, and I realized that I'd painted this painting the day before, and the odd part of the story is that he died in a river and that stream below the figure in my painting is a stream that goes through a little river valley. So the whole thing became quite a bizarre kind of confluence of events. Yeah.
And then coming back to the Goya, the Goya figures look almost heavy compared to your light figure up there. They look like they're falling, and yours is rising. It would seem to me.
Yeah, they do, don't they? Yeah.
Yeah, I suppose that the old women are more kind of airborne, aren't they? They're very, very strange.
I guess so. I think a lot of his figures are drawn, as it were, from people sitting on things or sitting on the ground, and then he just hasn't put a ground underneath them, so that they do feel like they're kind of heavy. But that was what makes them so strange as well, actually.
There was an exhibition of this album at the Courtauld a few years ago, and it was extraordinary getting to look at them. I don't know if you got to see it, but...
I did, yeah. It was fantastic.
They're fabulous, really fabulous.
No going to the Courtauld just for the moment.
No. Although they have put them, they have put the Courtauld Gallery online. I mean, not this, because this was a temporary exhibition, but there is a good virtual gallery, so you can go and have a look at it. That's a plug for the Courtauld where I teach part of the time. So, but nothing to do with the gallery, sadly. But yeah.
Just going back to one of your original questions, and you asked me why art at this point was important, and something I didn't say at the time, but I think which relates to the phenomenon of so many artists offering up their works online, is that, in my own life I've noticed that when I've had a troubled time, I've always just sort of retreated to the studio, and I think when you are attempting to create something that you consider beautiful, it does seem to give some meaning to whatever situation you're in at the time. And maybe that's what it is that we need some meaning in the face of a sort of meaningless threat, and it threatens this meaningless threat. It threatens our sense of self and what we're doing here. And so we look to artists and writers and poets, I think, to help us with that understanding. So if there's anything important about it now, I think it's that.
Yeah, I've noticed that poetry and visual arts are both seem to be great, because they sort of help you realize that you have to also live in the moment, and that you just have to look out the window and look at beautiful things and look at the sky and look at, somehow appreciate life, what we have of it, rather than always thinking forward, well, what's going to come next,
Yes.
Where would I be today if it wasn't, for this? So.
Well, exactly. I mean, everything seemed to, prior to this, everything seemed to be conditioned by what was over the next hill, and do you know what I mean? So we weren't focusing on what was right in front of our noses, but what was, as you say, what was going to be coming next, and how we were best going to be prepared for that. And that took up one's whole time, or one's whole life, was preparing for what's going to happen next.
Yeah, especially the last 2 or 3 years have been like that, haven't they?
Yeah, they absolutely have. Yeah.
Well, let's get back to the eternal truth. So here we have your Saint Bartholomew. So we've got the flames again.
Well, this is again, this goes back to the days before I really thought of the work as having anything, or the light in the work having anything to do with religious iconography. And the title, this painting was titled after I realized that I was painting in a long tradition of artists who've used the sort of spectral light as a way to illustrate revelation of some sort. And so these figures and these faces stem from the opposite end, as it were. They come from a series of photographs I found of Georgia State Penitentiary inmates who were all on death row, and they were the mugshots, as it were, of the guys who, and they were all men, who were due to be electrocuted. This was in 1959, and I found a box of them at a old bookstore, And it just occurred to me that when I spent a lot of time looking at them before, and had them run in the studio for a long time before I knew what to do with them. But there was something about the expression on the guys' faces that reminded me of something, and eventually I figured out what it was. And I was looking through a book of Russian icons, the saints, and I noticed there was exactly the same look in their faces, and I was wondering what that look could possibly be. It was a sort of, to define it, I would suggest it was a look of somebody who knows exactly what their future is, but for very different reasons. You know, they're looking into the future. Look on the guy's face here. He knows where he's going. And I think with the icons, the Russian icons, the saints have a similar kind of steady look of somebody who knows exactly where they're going. They're as sure of their future as the inmates in Georgia State Penitentiary were of their future, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, and you actually have a whole. You've developed this flame into. There's a whole theme. It's a theme in your work, isn't it?
It is very much so. Yeah. This is one of a group of about 50 paintings of have you got some more?
I've got some more of the Potter's Hands. Yeah, I have here. Yeah.
Oh yeah, exactly. Yeah, which will form a very large wall piece of hands all offering this divine light, hopefully illuminating the way. So this is again going back to my familiar theme of light and candles.
But you're very interested in the Sufi, the concept of light, aren't you? I think you've spoken to me about that before.
Yes, absolutely. Like I said before, you know, the way that the light has been used as a way to illustrate revelation and knowledge and understanding and illumination within the Sufi tradition, which is one that I study. Light is seen very much as a sort of central motif, out of which comes understanding and love, even the light of the world, it being a kind of light that is charged with love. And if I can use that energy in some of these paintings, then I would have done my job. It's very difficult to explain it on an emotional level, but it has such a strong resonance for me that I keep on going back to it day after day. And like I said, it's personal iconography, and that one doesn't really know whether it makes any sense to anyone else, but you sort of have to keep on plugging away.
Well, I think it's a theme which has come back, you know, has been fascinating to people, viewers and artists for centuries, because what it made me think of was things like this Georges de la Tour, you know, a Vanitas painting, you know, again, in many ways, she's carrying the skull, but, you know, also this light. And he did so many, and he did paintings. There's one called The Newborn, where literally the child is the light, you know, and it's not meant to be, I don't think, or maybe it's only allegorically, is it a religious image, but you know, talk about love and light, you know, it's the newborn child which is the light in this painting.
They're interesting, yes. I mean, you know, he was great, a great master of that phenomenon. And I think one does, like you say, I think you look at Georges de la Tour and you know that he's not just painting a candle. You know, there's much more than the candle going on, and the metaphor is strong in those works, even though they are sort of on the surface of it a sort of domestic scene. There's no question about the significance of the light. Well, interestingly, this painting is very much like, you know, I think we were talking about the show in Sweden at the National Gallery there.
Yeah. And then here's the painting that's in the show in Sweden, I believe. Is that right?
Yeah, well, I'm just going back to the George Latour. There's a wonderful Matt Collishaw photograph of a mother and child. I think it's the mother and child one that he did. That's just sort of a modern variation of a George de Latour. This show really brings together some of the collection from the Swedish National Gallery and art that's been contemporary art that is using the themes, some of the themes of the old masters. So it's a very large exhibition. The title is called Inspiration Iconic Works, and it has a lot of very interesting work in it that references old masters. Everyone from Mark Quinn to Tracy Emin to Matt Collishaw and Sam Taylor Johnson, Robin Nick Carter, Glenn Brown. Anyway, so this exhibition's going off it's in transit right now to Finland, to Helsinki, to the National Gallery there. So hopefully they'll be able to open it in the next few months.
So tell me about this painting of yours, the Entombment after Rembrandt, because this is in the exhibition.
It is in the exhibition, yeah. Well, it's based on that really lovely kind of shadowy painting of Rembrandt's called The Entombment. And I'd seen that at Dulwich Picture Gallery. And it just gave me an idea for a painting. That instead of the shroud made from cloth, I used kind of cling film, kind of plastic, and that seemed to me to speak something of our commodification of Christ and religion nowadays, and that was part of what I was wanting to. That was part of the message, and then this big sign, municipal sign above it. Is part of an experiment I'm doing, which several paintings at the moment should go into the next exhibition of matching paintings that are based on old masters or religious painting with municipal signage, and to see how the juxtaposition corresponds with each other. And in my view, what can be drawn from this is that there are parallels between the two, curiously, which on the surface of it you can't really see, but if I explain it, I can show you what my thought process was, which is that the municipal signage of today is essentially doing what religious painting did in the Middle Ages, which was, because of the illiteracy, they were using images to essentially guide you on the straight and narrow, and they would give you the sense like, well, if you did this and you did this and you did this, then everything will be fine, and if you did this, you're going straight to hell, you're going to be in big trouble. And then if you look around, if you were somebody from that time and you came to our modern world, and in the cities at least, and were looking around for guidance, as it were, for life, you would be forgiven thinking that actually the most ubiquitous type of imagery that we have around us, it is actually road signage or signage in general. And you could see some of our signage as being some kind of strange metaphor for doing the right thing, being told what to do, making sure you don't go down the wrong path, a cul-de-sac, so there seems to be, in the absence of religious guidance for our lives, we've kind of relinquished that in favour of the way in which we're guided in all sorts of other ways by our governments and the way that, well, I mean, it sounds a bit extreme, but it's really true. I mean, we need to have in our lives these signs and symbols to make sure we don't walk off a cliff, or that we don't, or in an emergency we know where to go, just as they did in the Middle Ages with religious painting.
And here's another painting that you showed a few years ago in Venice, I believe. Is that right?
Yeah, that was 2017 Biennale, where there was, as you may know, there are several churches that are opened up for exhibition all around Venice, and I was offered this particular chapel right next to St Mark's, where I showed this painting alongside the 6 reliquary paintings, and being in such close proximity to St Mark's turned out to be very, well, not just because it was central, but very fortuitous for other reasons as well, one of which was that the Vatican curator who came to see the show, or came to the opening of the show, had asked me, he said, well, did you know or did you plan this exhibition because of the rotunda in St Mark's that has all of the saints with the tongues of flames on their heads, which was literally a minute's walk away. Yeah, there you go, there it is. And of course I'd been to the Basilica many times, but I'd never actually noticed that all of the saints have these tongues of flame on their heads, and it's actually quite a rare image in a church, especially in this kind of format. So I was really surprised. That was kind of an amazing coincidence that that the theme had sort of translated across the centuries and then found its way almost to its doorstep. And that was one of the things that was very interesting that happened. And the other thing was that there was a extraordinary concert of the Russian National Choir from Moscow in the catacombs underneath St Mark's, which we were very privileged to be invited to. It was like 7 a.m, and had a special invitation to go down there and listen to these extraordinary Russian singers. And the person, one of the people who was responsible for bringing them to Venice, was a collector of mine, and he introduced me to them afterwards. And the singers were fascinated about Venice, and most of them had never been there before. And they asked me where my exhibition was, and I said it was just around the corner. So the entire choir arrived at this sort of sepulchral little chapel around the corner from St Mark's during the afternoon, and they all piled in and was quite moved by the painting, I think, and the other works that were up there, and burst into song. And I got this lovely video of them singing a choral piece, as it were, to the painting, which is quite a special moment.
Well, the other work that it made me think of was Caravaggio. That the sort of extraordinary, the chiaroscuro, the focus, the intense focus light, which just gives it such an extraordinary presence. I mean, I think this has got to be I think it's one of my favourite paintings in the world. It's just amazing.
It really is, yeah. I love that painting. It's such an incredible painting, and God, can't you see the Velázquez in there as well? Jeez, especially on the forehead of the soldier gripping onto the Christ figure. That little passage up there looks just, and the nose looks just like the water cellar. Velázquez water cellar. Gorgeous, absolutely gorgeous. But I mean, the lighting on this is so incredible too. And well, we can go on and on about the lighting in Caravaggio and how it's affected art and even film down the centuries. it's I find it a bit. Well, there's a whole kind of theory that Caravaggio was using camera obscura to get these light effects, but I actually don't hold with that at all. And not, being a painter and interested in the light effects anyway, you certainly don't need to have a device to paint those things.
I think, as you say, Velázquez, Caravaggio, Van Eyck, these are all painters who just really are masters of handling light, and it's wonderful to see that this is a tradition that you're carrying the baton.
I can't help myself. I've tried sometimes to move away from it, because over the years, it's quite difficult sometimes to live in the contemporary art world with one foot in the past and 1 foot looking forward. It's sometimes difficult position to justify. The contemporary art world sometimes rather looks askance at has done anyway, in the 35 years I've been painting. It looked askance at anything that is referencing art before the 20th century. But thankfully, in the last sort of 15 years, it's become actually an essential part of the dialogue again. And thank God, because I think to dismiss the past as irrelevant, or as the futurists said, I think one of the futurists, I can't remember which one, in the early 20th century said that museums and art galleries that dealt with old masters were irrelevant and possibly dangerous.
Yeah, I think so. There more people more recently have said that as well. So, that's one of the reasons Colnaghi Foundation exists, and we're having conversations with people like you. So, I'm so pleased. But maybe just to come on to a last couple of themes here. So, and again, the light theme, made me think of Zurbarán. You mentioned Velázquez, but there's also Zurbarán, who has this extraordinary. Some of his paintings have this extraordinary, again, this inner light, which made me think a lot about your paintings. And then I saw that you'd painted this, and I thought that was really, it was completely by coincidence that I came to that, and then I found this. So,
well, it is amazing how you've paired some of my work with the sources that I use, which is the Zurbarán again is a big favourite of mine, especially the paintings where he uses these monks, the white robes, and that kind of, sort of he's in love with the way those folds move around his body. It's just gorgeous. And I was doing something, I was working on this in the same way with this one. It's essentially two robed figures leaning on each other, but you can't tell which one is leaning on which. In a funny way, but this is the beginning. This is the bottom half of a painting. That the top half in this photograph is not completed, and there will be above it one of my municipal signs. But that will be in the next exhibition. Maybe you'll be coming to that hopefully.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Well, we'll have to have another conversation then. Paul, let's just finish with your portraits, because you are a wonderful portraitist, and you were telling me you have a very interesting take on artist practice and portraiture.
Well, I don't know what the interesting take is, but I feel I'm as passionate about painting people as I am about painting anything else. So, my personal practice is really a dialogue I have with myself. Which I equate more with poetry. I suppose if I was a writer, that would relate more with poetry. And then my portraiture I consider to be more like prose, I suppose, in the way that Proust is prose, but it has a sort of a strong relationship to real life. And so when I look at people, I look out at the world, and I use my experience of the world and of people bring that to bear on a portrait, just as I would as a novelist if I was writing a novel about the world, people in the world, a story. And I've always felt that, the two practices, which in some ways can be seen as kind of a little schizophrenic in today's world, there's two practices being portraiture and then my own personal work, but relate very strongly to, especially in the history of art, to most of the great painters that we know of in history, Rembrandt, and Caravaggio and Velázquez and Van Dyck and all sorts of Rubens. They have their portrait practice, and some of the most extraordinary paintings in all of art history are portraits, commissioned portraits actually, incidentally. And a lot of them were commissioned portraits. And then they also had their, well, in those days were allegorical or historical painting practice as well, often commissioned by the same patrons, but very different genres and seen as very different genres now. But I feel strongly that as a contemporary artist, that shouldn't preclude me from using my interest in other human beings and their physiognomy and their psychology and their emotional lives as a form of inspiration and a subject worthy of one's time as a painter. So I know in the past it's been slightly frowned on that anybody would spend their time doing commissions at all, but I don't believe that to be true anymore. In fact, I don't think it was ever true. I think the two practices can cross-fertilize in a funny way, that they inform each other. So yeah, that's really where I stand on this subject.
Great. Well, Paul, thank you so much for talking to me today. It's been wonderful and fascinating. I wish I could get to the exhibition in Finland. Maybe I will. Who knows what will happen in the next few months if lockdown is ever lifted.
I think it opens in June, as far as I remember. Yeah, well, we should all go.
Well, thank you, Paul, and good luck with everything.
Well, thank you. Yeah, no, it's really good to talk to you.
Excellent.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.